Claire dropped the folder by accident, papers sliding across the clean office floor, and as she bent down to gather them, a strange awareness washed over her, sharp and sudden, like a warning she couldn't explain, because she felt someone standing right behind her, close enough that the air felt warmer, closer than was normal, and for a split second her body froze even though nothing inappropriate had happened. The office was quiet, professional, ordinary, yet her heart started beating faster. As if it sensed something her mind refused to accept, and she slowly reached for the papers while memories rushed through her head of the past few months, of late evenings at work, quiet conversations near the coffee machine, shared looks that lasted just a moment too long, and words that felt heavier than they sounded, because Claire's life on the surface looked steady and respectable, married for 8 years, living in a neat home in a quiet neighborhood outside Seattle, but inside she had been feeling invisible for a long time, like her voice echoed back empty, and as she straightened up with the folder held tight against her chest, she realized the presence behind her belonged to Ethan, her co-worker. A man who never crossed lines, but somehow stood close to them without touching, and he said her name softly, not sudden, not loud, just enough to let her know he was there. And that simple sound made her chest tighten with emotions she had been pushing down every day, because Ethan didn't speak to her like everyone else. He listened, he noticed when she was tired, when her smile was forced, when she stayed late not because of deadlines, but because home felt too quiet. And standing there in that moment, Claire felt the weight of how one small ordinary action could carry so much meaning, how bending down for a folder could bring her face to face with the truth she had been avoiding, that something in her life was shifting without permission, and she stepped aside quickly, thanking him in a polite voice, pretending nothing was wrong, but inside she knew something had already changed, because attraction doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in kindness and understanding, and as she walked back to her desk, her thoughts drifted to Daniel, her husband, the good man who worked long hours and came home tired, who still cared but no longer noticed the small things, and guilt settled in her stomach even though she hadn't done anything wrong. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was a warning, a line she was standing near without meaning to, and the rest of the day passed in a blur of emails and meetings while her mind replayed that brief pause behind her, not as something physical, but as a reminder of how lonely she had felt and how dangerous that loneliness could become. And by the time she left the office and stepped into the cool evening air, Claire understood that this was not just another workday memory, it was the beginning of a question she could no longer ignore, a question about her marriage, her needs, and what happens when emotional distance grows so quietly that no one notices until it's already standing right behind you. Claire couldn't stop thinking about the brief moment with Ethan, the way he had been there without touching her, the gentleness in his voice, and it made her realize how much she had been craving attention, connection, someone to truly see her, because at home with Daniel, things had grown routine, predictable and safe, but safe had begun to feel empty. The quiet dinners, the separate evenings in front of screens, the polite conversations that never reached her heart. And yet she loved Daniel, she really did, which made her feelings all the more confusing and heavy. And at work, Ethan had always been kind, not flirty, not crossing lines, just attentive in ways that made Claire feel alive, like when he remembered that she liked her coffee black with a little cinnamon, or asked about her weekend in a way that made her pause and think, or smiled at her in the hallway and held the door for her longer than necessary, little gestures that suddenly felt monumental, and she tried to push it away, telling herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things, that she was being silly, but the truth was undeniable, that something inside her had woken up, a longing she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, and she noticed it in small ways, a glance lingering a fraction too long, a heart skipping a beat, when their hands brushed over papers, a warmth in her chest when he offered to help carry something or walked with her to the parking lot, all of it innocent, professional, yet impossible to ignore, and she found herself replaying conversations in her head, wondering if he felt it too, if he noticed the tiny sparks of awareness, and it scared her because she had always prided herself on being loyal, on knowing right from wrong, but emotions were messy, uncontrollable, and sometimes they arrived quietly, under the radar, and now they had arrived, and Claire couldn't unsee them, couldn't unsense the pull, couldn't go back to ignoring the emptiness that had been growing between her and Daniel, who was exhausted from work, distracted, loving in his own quiet way, but no longer able to meet her where she was, and she felt the guilt pressing down, because she was aware that she was walking a line, and yet she couldn't deny the warmth, the light, the feeling of being seen that Ethan gave her, and it made her home life feel heavier. More difficult, like a puzzle she didn't know how to solve, and she spent hours thinking, walking through the office, arranging papers, answering emails mechanically while her mind drifted, imagining conversations that might never happen, moments that were just glimpses of what could be, and every time she tried to focus on Daniel, she found herself distracted, noticing how quiet he had become, how tired he looked, how little he smiled, and she realized that love alone wasn't enough when attention and presence were missing, and that longing, even unspoken, could shape decisions more than reason, and the office, once just a place of work, now felt like a stage for unacknowledged emotions, and every small interaction with Ethan felt charged, like a quiet confession without words, and Claire knew that she couldn't continue pretending nothing was happening, couldn't ignore her own heart, couldn't stop feeling what she was feeling, and as days passed, the subtle tension built into something undeniable, something that made her heart race when she saw him in the hallway, made her stomach tighten when she realized how much she looked forward to seeing him, made her question everything she thought she understood about herself, and in the quiet moments alone at her desk, she admitted to herself that the simplest interactions, shared smiles, gentle words, fleeting glances, had become her lifeline, a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of feeling deeply, and that realization terrified her because she knew that recognizing a feeling didn't mean acting on it, but ignoring it could mean losing herself, losing clarity, and that every choice she made in the coming days would be heavier, because she could no longer pretend that her heart was idle, that her emotions were simple, that her life was just routine, because it had changed subtly, invisibly, and the consequences were yet to unfold, building quietly, like a storm that waited for the perfect moment to arrive, and Claire understood that this was only the beginning of a journey she hadn't planned for, that the quiet pull she felt toward Ethan was part of a larger story she needed to confront, and the line between loyalty and longing had never felt so delicate, so fragile, so impossible to navigate, as she realized that the life she thought was straightforward had begun to twist and curve into a path she couldn't predict, and with every step, every glance, every smile, the slow mystery of what might happen next wrapped around her heart tighter, making her aware that the choices she would face were not just about love, but about truth, honesty, and the courage to face emotions that were impossible to ignore, and she wondered if Daniel would ever sense the emptiness she felt, if he would notice the silent spaces between them, or if it would take something irreversible for him to see, while at the same time, Ethan's quiet presence reminded her of what she had been missing, of connection, attention, and understanding, and that gentle awareness created a tension inside her. One that was tender, emotional, romantic in its simplicity, impossible to label, and profoundly human, leaving her caught between two worlds, wondering how to navigate feelings that were real, meaningful, yet complicated by circumstance, loyalty, and years of routine, and she realized that life often didn't wait for clarity, that emotions didn't follow schedules, that hearts didn't obey reason, and as she closed her eyes for a brief moment in the middle of a meeting, she admitted to herself that the pull toward Ethan wasn't something to fight with logic alone, that it was alive, present, and demanding acknowledgement, and that the coming days would force her to confront the reality she had been avoiding, a reality of subtle attraction, emotional awakening, and the unspoken question of what it truly meant to feel seen, to feel wanted, and to feel alive in a life that had grown quiet and safe, yet somehow incomplete. That afternoon, the office felt different to Claire, as if every sound, every movement, every glance carried extra weight, and when she bent down to pick up a dropped pen, she sensed Ethan behind her again, and this time, he didn't speak at first, he simply let her rise with the pen in her hand, and when she finally looked up, their eyes met, and the intensity of the moment made her heart race, because there was no inappropriate touch, no sudden movement, just presence, a quiet understanding that neither of them needed words to communicate, and the sensation was electric yet subtle, the kind that leaves you aware of your own feelings for the first time in years, and she remembered all the little things about him, the way he always listened fully, never interrupting, the way he asked questions that showed he cared, how he laughed at the right moments, how he noticed the smallest details, gestures that most people would ignore, and it struck her how lonely she had been in her marriage, how her life with Daniel had become predictable, comfortable, yet empty, and suddenly she realized that what she was feeling wasn't simple, it was complicated, messy, emotional, romantic even, and it scared her, because she had always been loyal, always valued honesty, and yet here she was, feeling warmth and longing she hadn't acknowledged for years, a pull towards someone who had never tried to cross boundaries, yet his presence alone stirred feelings she hadn't expected, and she thought about Daniel, how much she loved him, how devoted he was, how they had shared years together, yet how little attention he now paid to the small, meaningful things that kept love alive, how dinners were quiet, evenings spent in front of the TV in separate rooms, conversations reduced to logistics, and the contrast between that life and the moments with Ethan made her chest ache, because she realized that connection wasn't just about love, it was about presence, attention, emotional resonance, and Ethan had given her that in ways she hadn't experienced in years. Subtle, patient, and completely non-threatening, yet deeply stirring, and as she walked back to her desk, she felt the weight of her emotions pressing down, the mix of guilt, desire, longing, and fear all colliding inside her, because she didn't want to betray Daniel, didn't want to ruin her life, yet couldn't ignore the truth of her own feelings, and she replayed the afternoon in her mind, the way Ethan had looked at her, the care in his eyes, the soft tone of his voice when he finally spoke. "Are you okay?" And she had nodded, pretending nothing had happened, but inside, her heart had leapt, recognizing the bond that had quietly formed, and she wondered how much he sensed, how much he understood without words, how much of their mutual awareness existed in the space between them, unspoken, unacknowledged, but powerful, undeniable, and that night, when she went home, the quiet of her own house felt heavier than usual, the silence pressing in, the familiar hum of the refrigerator, and the distant sound of traffic outside reminding her that life was moving. That choices were waiting, that emotions couldn't be paused indefinitely, and sitting across from Daniel at dinner, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes, the polite smile that no longer reached his heart, she felt the pang of guilt and sorrow at the same time, knowing she still loved him, but also knowing that the love had changed, shifted, had gaps that had been ignored for too long, and she realized that the attraction to Ethan wasn't just about infatuation, it was about longing, about emotional recognition, about the feeling of being truly seen, and the realization shook her, made her question her own strength, her own loyalty, her own courage to face emotions that were alive and demanding attention, and she thought about the future, about the conversations she would need to have, about the honesty required to navigate a heart divided by care and attention, and yet in that tension, she also felt alive, awakened to the reality that life was more complicated than she had allowed herself to admit, that love wasn't always simple, that attraction wasn't always about physical presence, but about emotional resonance, understanding, connection, and that subtle tension, that quiet pull toward someone who respected boundaries yet stirred her heart, was powerful enough to make her reconsider her priorities, her needs, and her willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and she understood that the coming days would test her, would force her to examine her marriage, her desires, her ability to stay honest with herself, her courage to act with integrity, and yet the warmth she felt when she remembered Ethan's presence, the way he made her feel acknowledged, alive, important, lingered in her chest, a reminder that life was not about comfort alone, but about emotional depth, meaningful connection, and the choices we make when confronted with feelings that cannot be ignored. And as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she admitted to herself that this wasn't a fleeting moment, wasn't a trivial distraction, but a turning point, a revelation of what she had been missing, what she craved, what she feared, and the quiet, electric tension of that afternoon, simple, innocent, professional, yet charged with meaning, stayed with her, building an emotional storm that would demand attention, reflection, and courage in the days to come. Because sometimes the heart notices things before the mind is ready, sometimes longing grows quietly in the spaces we ignore. And sometimes a simple presence, a kind word, a soft glance, can awaken something inside that changes everything. A few days later, the tension that Claire had been carrying between her emotions for Daniel and the quiet pull toward Ethan reached a tipping point, because life has a way of forcing clarity when feelings are left unspoken, and it began with Daniel, who, after noticing her distant smiles, her distracted evenings, and the way she lingered on phone calls, finally spoke with honesty. That shook her, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with a cup of tea between them, his hands wrapped around it as if seeking warmth, and he said, softly but firmly, "I feel like we're drifting apart, Claire. I miss us. I miss the woman I fell in love with," and those words hit her harder than any glance from Ethan, because they carried a vulnerability she hadn't seen in years, a raw truth that forced her to confront the emptiness she had been feeling and how much she had missed the attention and care that had once filled her marriage. And she realized in that moment that Daniel's awareness and courage to speak were a gift, that their love, though dimmed by years of routine, was still alive enough to be salvaged if nurtured, yet at the same time, her mind couldn't ignore Ethan, whose presence at work had been gentle, patient, and unspoken, creating a quiet tension that made her heart ache, and the contrast between Daniel's confession and Ethan's quiet attentiveness created a storm of emotions, because she loved Daniel, yet she couldn't deny the awakening Ethan had sparked in her, making her realize that emotional neglect can sometimes be as painful as betrayal, and that love requires attention, presence, and active effort. And she spent the next day at the office noticing Ethan in a new light, aware that he had sensed the change, yet maintained his professionalism, never overstepping, never speaking more than necessary, yet somehow conveying understanding, support, and care in every gesture, from offering a quiet word of encouragement to simply walking past with a smile that felt warmer than before. And then came the news that Ethan was transferring to another branch in Chicago, and the sudden reality of his absence created a pang in Claire's chest that she couldn't ignore, because while he had never crossed the line, his quiet presence had made her feel alive in ways she hadn't felt for years, reminding her of what she had been missing emotionally, and that realization brought clarity, forcing her to confront the truth that the tension she felt wasn't about temptation or desire in the physical sense, but about emotional recognition, being truly seen and appreciated. And she understood that the real challenge was not Ethan, but the gaps in her own marriage, the moments of neglect that had allowed longing to grow, and she realized that facing these truths was necessary if she wanted to rebuild her relationship with Daniel. And she spent the next few days reflecting deeply, thinking about the life they had built together, the quiet love that had sustained them, and the potential for renewal if honesty, effort, and attention were restored. And she also thought about Ethan, not with guilt for feelings she couldn't control, but with appreciation for what he had reminded her about herself and her needs, and this awareness allowed her to separate the emotions she felt from actions, understanding that recognizing attraction or connection does not require betrayal, but does require courage to be honest with oneself and with those you love. And as Ethan packed his belongings on his last day, she found herself saying goodbye with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, smiling through a lump in her throat, thanking him for his kindness, for his attentiveness, for making her feel seen. And she realized that letting go was not a loss, but a choice to honor her marriage and her own integrity. And returning home that evening, she sat with Daniel once again, speaking openly about her feelings, the loneliness she had felt, the need for connection, the importance of attention, and the cracks that had formed quietly over the years. And Daniel listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes holding her hand, his eyes reflecting understanding, regret, and a willingness to fight for what they had lost. And in that exchange, Claire felt a mixture of relief, fear, and hope, realizing that emotional honesty could heal wounds that silence had deepened, and that love required effort, attention, and courage to confront uncomfortable truths. And that evening, as they sat together in quiet reflection, she knew that the real challenge had never been Ethan, never been temptation, but the distance they had allowed to grow in their marriage. And now, faced with clarity, courage, and honesty, there was an opportunity to rebuild, to reconnect, and to embrace the love that had never truly faded. And Claire understood that life often tests relationships, not through dramatic betrayals, but through quiet neglect, unspoken feelings, and missed opportunities for connection, and that confronting those truths, taking responsibility for emotions, and choosing integrity over impulse, could lead to deeper, more meaningful love. And that realization, though challenging, filled her with a sense of purpose, a desire to restore intimacy, and a commitment to face her heart, her marriage, and her own choices with honesty, bravery, and care, knowing that the journey ahead would require patience, effort, and understanding, yet was worth every step, because it was rooted in truth, love, and the chance to reclaim what had been quietly slipping away. On Ethan's last day at the office, Claire felt a mix of emotions she hadn't anticipated, a strange combination of relief, sadness, gratitude, and clarity, because his departure was a reminder of the quiet pull she had felt, the emotional awakening that had stirred inside her, and yet it also underscored the choices she needed to make, and as she walked up to him, she noticed the gentle professionalism in his demeanor, the way he maintained boundaries even while his eyes conveyed understanding, care, and unspoken words, and she felt her throat tighten as she said, "Thank you, Ethan, for everything," meaning more than just help at work, meaning the awareness he had brought to her heart, the reminder that she deserved attention, understanding, and connection, and he smiled softly, nodded, and said, "Take care, Claire. I hope you find happiness," and in that moment, she realized that letting him go wasn't about losing something forbidden, but about choosing integrity, about honoring the life she had built with Daniel while acknowledging the emotional truths she could not ignore, and she left the office with a weight lifted, a clarity forming, a quiet resolution that life required honesty, courage, and the bravery to face difficult emotions, and returning home, she saw Daniel sitting on the couch, reading quietly, and she felt the familiar mix of love and fear, the fear of confronting the distance that had grown between them over the years, and yet she knew she had to speak, to open her heart fully, and she began, her voice soft but steady, "Daniel, I need to tell you something, about us, about how I've been feeling," and he looked up, his expression attentive, caring, and for the first time in a long while, she felt heard before even speaking, and she told him about the loneliness she had experienced, the quiet yearning for connection, the emotional distance that had crept between them, the way she had felt seen in small ways outside their marriage, not as a betrayal, but as a reflection of what she had been missing, and Daniel listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes reaching for her hand, his eyes reflecting understanding, remorse, and a desire to bridge the gap, and as the conversation unfolded, they shared memories, acknowledged mistakes, and expressed hopes for rebuilding their intimacy and emotional closeness, and Claire felt a mixture of relief, fear, and renewed hope, because honesty, though painful, created space for growth, connection, and renewal, and she realized that love wasn't about perfection, nor was it about ignoring emotions that arose naturally, but about facing them with courage, communicating openly, and committing to presence and attention in ways that nurture both partners. And over the next few days, Claire and Daniel began small steps toward Reconnect, longer conversations over coffee, shared laughter at small jokes, quiet evenings talking about dreams and fears, noticing each other again, listening with intent, and creating moments that reminded them of the love that had been there all along, but had been overshadowed by routine, and Claire reflected on Ethan's role in this awakening, understanding that he had never been a threat to her marriage, but a mirror showing her the parts of herself and her relationship that needed attention, and letting him go gracefully reinforced her choice to prioritize honesty, integrity, and emotional responsibility, and that night, sitting beside Daniel, feeling the warmth of his hand in hers, she understood that real change doesn't come from dramatic gestures or shocking events, but from quiet, consistent efforts, from conversations that are uncomfortable yet necessary, from the bravery to confront your own feelings and the needs of your partner, and she felt a deep, emotional gratitude for having faced the truths of her heart, for recognizing the subtle yet powerful forces that shaped her emotions, for choosing to act with integrity, and for embracing the chance to rebuild, reconnect, and nurture the love that had quietly waited for attention. And as they talked long into the night, Claire realized that bending down to pick up a folder at work, feeling Ethan behind her, had been a moment of awakening, not temptation, a spark that revealed truths she could no longer ignore, and that the real transformation came not from desire, but from awareness, courage, and choice, from the willingness to face emotional complexity with honesty and care. And in that realization, she found peace, hope, and a renewed sense of love that was richer, deeper, and more conscious than ever before, knowing that relationships survive and thrive not by avoiding feelings, but by acknowledging them, communicating openly, and choosing connection over convenience. And in the quiet of her living room that night, with Daniel beside her, she smiled softly, feeling the full weight and promise of emotional truth, understanding that the journey of love required attention, patience, and bravery, and that sometimes, the moments that change everything are not dramatic, but subtle, gentle, and deeply human, teaching us that honesty, presence, and courage are the real agents of transformation in our hearts and in our lives.